This is a video on how to change Carson's pod. First of all, you need to get the right supplies. You need one individually packaged pod that comes with its own syringe. You need an alcohol prep wipe. You need insulin.
Novolog.
Enough Novolog insulin to fill the syringe. And you need Carson's PDM in his Omnipod kit. This green thing right here. So first of all, what we want to do is, you don't want to get close-ups of this. You want to press the home button on Carson's Omnipod. I'm going to take it out of the... until it turns on. And it'll come up with a screen. Every time you turn it on or press the home button, it comes up with a screen that says Captain Stinky. That's just Carson's nickname. So we know that this is Carson's Omnipod and not mine. So you want to hit confirm. And then you want to go to home.
Hold it so that, yeah, there you go.
Press the button underneath where it says home here at the bottom of the screen. You want to go arrow down, highlight more actions, hit select. You want to change the pod. So if that is highlighted, go down and hit select again. It says press confirm to begin the pod change process. This will deactivate your current pod, and that is what we want to do. That's the first step. You want to deactivate the pod he's wearing. So you hit confirm. Carson, come closer. And it will deactivate the pod he is wearing now. So pod deactivated, remove and discard the pod, then press next. So you go ahead and hit next. So now we're going to take off Carson's pod, and he knows how to do that. The adhesive is really sticky, so sometimes it hurts when he peels it off. Come on, peel it. Alright, so this is the old pod which can be discarded. Next, we want to fill the new pod. So we open up the package, dump the contents out. Go over there. And you want to get the syringe and the needle cap, or the needle to the syringe. And the needle, you push it onto the syringe and it just kind of screws in. Once it's screwed in all the way, pull off the needle cap. And the syringe, you kind of want to run the plunger a couple of times just so it makes it easier. And Carson always gets the minimum amount of insulin in his syringe. So it's this first line right here that says minimum. That's about 80 units of insulin.
Oh, let me try and turn the thing so you can see it. There you go.
So we want to get 80 units. So you put the plunger at 80 units. Take the insulin, put the syringe in the insulin, and plunge that amount of air into the insulin vial. And you want to really squeeze the plunger down so you get all the air out of the syringe before you draw the insulin back in. And it kind of creates a vacuum so the insulin is drawn into the syringe pretty easily. But you just want to pull the plunger down until you're back at that 80 unit mark, so the minimum mark. And then once you do that, make sure there are no air bubbles in the syringe. If there are, they're really hard to get out, so that's actually pretty good. So you want to... Sometimes you can try to get the air bubbles out. Some of them are pretty stubborn and won't come out. Run the plunger a couple of times. And you want to always end up at that minimum mark. So you pull the plunger. So once you have the syringe filled with insulin to the minimum 80 unit mark, you want to take this, do you want me to put it closer? You want to take the syringe, and there's an arrow on the back of the pod next to the hole where you put the insulin into the pod. So you stick the syringe needle right in the middle of that hole, and you should feel it go right into the pod. You just push it all the way down, and then you push the plunger down and squirt the insulin into the pod reservoir. And it should beep once it has all the insulin inside. So then you pull out the syringe, place the needle cap back on the syringe, I'll push it all the way down, and then just unscrew the needle from the syringe, and this can be discarded in the sharps container, and this can just be discarded in the trash. So, Carson, come on over here, please. So once that is done, you want to turn Carson's pod, his PDM, back on. You might have to confirm. It says no active pod. Would you like to activate a pod now? You want to hit yes. It says fill a new pod with insulin, which we have done. After filling pod, listen for 2 beeps, then press next. And it says do not remove the needle cap at this time. The needle cap is actually this clear cap on the back of the pod. So for now, that stays in place. So after we fill the pod with insulin, you hit next. And here's where you want to place the PDM next to the pod you've just filled. And you want to leave it facing up, the pod and the PDM. And the PDM will prime the pod and push all the air out of the insulin reservoir. And it takes a couple of minutes. And it'll click while it's in the priming process. Usually, while it's priming, we prepare Carson's infusion site. So, Carson? So, we've been going in order on Carson's pod placement. We go his right arm, his left arm, and on his arms, you want to place the cannula in the upper portion of his bicep, facing outward. And you want the pod to go up and down rather than side to side on his arms and his legs. So we go right arm, left arm, his left abdomen, his left thigh, his right abdomen, and then back to his right arm. So Carson will usually remember what order we're going in and where to place the pod next. So if you can see, if you remember, we took the pod off of his left arm. You can see where the pod was inserted, and the cannula was inserted into his left arm. So now the next space is going to be the left side of his abdomen. So next, you'll see that the pod says prepare infusion site, remove pod's needle cap. If cannula sticks out as shown below, press discard. So when it says remove pod's needle cap, you want to pull this hard plastic part off of the pod. And it kind of feels like you're going to break it, but it just pulls right off. And you'll see the cannula is not sticking out. So far, I've never seen a cannula that's sticking out of the site in the pod. So usually you don't ever have to worry about that. So once you pull off the needle cap, you go ahead and hit next. And it says remove pod's adhesive backing. If pod is wet or dirty or adhesive is folded, press discard. Anytime you get a pod out of the box, the adhesive is going to be fine unless you get it wet or dirty or folded while you're prepping the site. So I don't pull off the adhesive until we're ready to stick it on. So before we can remove the backing, we need to prepare the infusion site. So we're going to take our alcohol prep wipe and open it up. And we're going to prepare a spot on Carson's left abdomen. So really, I just wipe down the whole left side of his abdomen with alcohol. And Carson's pretty good about doing this part as well. Any place that you think you're going to stick the pod, you want to wipe it down with alcohol. And luckily his abdomen's pretty small that we can cover that whole side. And the next thing you want to look for is a spot where you don't see any cannula marks. So you can kind of see one right here on his stomach. So you want to try to stay away from that area. So I'm going to stick the cannula somewhere in this area. You don't want to go too close to his belly button. You always want to stay about 1 inch or ½ an inch away from his belly button. So you never want to stick a cannula too close to his belly button. And also you don't want to stick it too close to his ribs or his upper abdomen or his hip bone, or too low toward his groin area. So really you want to keep it around the middle of his stomach and not too close to his belly button. So we've prepped the site, we've wiped it with alcohol, so now I'm going to peel off the adhesive backing, or the strips that cover the adhesive backing to the pod. And you want to be careful not to fold the adhesive and make it stick to itself like I just did. So this area right here is where the cannula is going to insert. So that's the part that we want to be careful about where we place it. So you can see there are no other cannula marks right here, so I'm going to go for this area right here. And on the abdomen, you always want the pod to go horizontally. You don't want it to go vertically. On his legs and his arms, you want it to go vertically, but on the abdomen, it's always horizontal. So I'm going to stick the cannula right in this area and just stick the pod right on his skin and kind of press it down. You want that adhesive to stick really well, and then smooth out the adhesive that surrounds the pod. That's what's going to keep it sticking to his body. So you want to try and make sure there's no folds or bubbles in the adhesive when you're sticking it on. Push your stomach a little bit, but and then once you have it stuck on really well, we're going to go ahead and insert the cannula. And to do that, you want to hit next once you're at this step. And then you come to the step that says press start to insert cannula and begin basal delivery. So what we want to do before we hit start is you want to pinch Carson's skin up like he's going to do an injection in the area where the cannula is going to insert. So you always want to pinch at this end of the pod where you have this little viewing window for the cannula. So you want to pinch up the skin right there. This is really important. And then go ahead and hit start. And you'll hear the pod start to tick. And that's when you know it's about to insert the cannula. And then you'll hear that click. That means the cannula is inserted. You want to make sure that on the pod there's a little pink, there's a square and there's a pink device that when the cannula is inserted, the pink square moves into this viewing square on the pod. That's one way you know that the cannula has inserted into the skin. Another way you can tell is you can kind of see it through this viewing window right here. You can kind of see the little blue cannula going into his skin if you look closely. Next on the PDM, you get a message that says pod is active. Basal 1 has been programmed. Check infusion site and cannula. And then it asks you, is cannula properly inserted? And once you see that this pink square has moved up on the pod and you can see the cannula, you want to go ahead and hit yes. And then it just goes back to the regular home screen. So then you know you've successfully started a new pod. Anything else you want to add? And Carson's good to go. And then in about an hour and a half, the pod and the PDM will start to alarm. And Carson needs to test his blood sugar and make sure that the cannula properly inserted and that it's delivering his insulin. If his blood sugar is too high, Well, and it also depends on how soon he's eaten. But if the blood sugar is high, you want to do a correction, and if it continues to be high and he's not eating anything, you might have to replace the pod and insert another pod, because it may be that it's not delivering insulin correctly. And I think that's it. We'll go ahead and do a second video on his leg when we do the next pod insertion.